Have you ever heard a knock and instantly felt unsure whether opening the door would bring relief or reopen something you spent years trying to bury? 2 days before Christmas, with the house unusually quiet and the tree lights blinking in that soft, uneven way they always do, I heard a knock that didn't sound urgent, but didn't sound accidental either, and for a moment I just stood there, my hand hovering, wondering why anyone would choose now to come back into a life they once walked away from. 8 years earlier, there had been no knock at all. No pause. No second thoughts. She left in the middle of an ordinary day, taking her certainty with her and leaving behind questions that had nowhere to land. 2 children who were too young to understand why routines disappeared overnight. A house that suddenly felt larger, colder, unfamiliar. I remember standing in the kitchen that first evening, listening to the refrigerator hum, realizing that silence isn't empty. It presses in on you, reshapes the space, changes how you move through it. I told myself then that dignity meant not begging for explanations from someone who had already decided we were optional. And for a long time, that belief was the only thing that made getting up each morning possible. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows as I waited by the door, not opening it yet, not stepping away either. 8 years is a long time to carry responsibility without relief. Life didn't shatter all at once after she left. It wore down slowly. School lunches, late-night fevers, parent-teacher meetings where I sat alone while other families arrived in pairs. I learned to answer questions without bitterness, to speak carefully, to protect my children from choosing sides they never asked for. I never erased her, but I never explained her either. And somewhere along the way, the waiting stopped, the hoping stopped. Her absence became something we built around, not something we expected to end. The tree lights flickered again. I glanced at the door. The knock came a second time, gentler now, almost hesitant. That's when the unease crept in, because hesitation wasn't part of who she used to be. For years, I'd imagined what it might feel like if she ever returned. Anger, accusations, maybe relief. But standing there, listening to the quiet stretch between knocks, what I felt instead was a sudden awareness of how much there was to lose. Peace is fragile when it's been earned the hard way. Stability doesn't announce itself. It just exists, quietly, until something threatens it. People think time heals betrayal. What it really does is teach you how to live without answers. 8 years passed. The children grew older. The house filled with new rhythms. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I stopped wondering whether regret would catch up with her. And that's the dangerous part of moving on. When the past loses its urgency, you stop guarding against it. You assume it won't return. The third knock was firmer, insistent. I felt the cold seeping through the doorframe now, mixing with the warmth behind me, and for the first time that evening, doubt surfaced. Was this about remorse? Desperation? Something worse I hadn't prepared for? The timing felt wrong in a way that made my chest tighten. Christmas has a way of softening memories, of convincing people they're owed forgiveness simply because the calendar says so. I finally opened the door. The cold rushed in first, sharp and immediate. Then I saw her. Familiar features rearranged by time. A face I recognized instantly, yet struggled to place in the life standing behind me. She looked smaller somehow, less certain, as if the years hadn't been kind. And in her hands, she carried something that made it clear this wasn't a visit fueled by nostalgia or guilt. It was a need, a reason. Here's the moment that changed everything, not because of what she said, but because of what I felt standing there. No rush of anger, no surge of relief, just a quiet, unsettling awareness that whatever she had come for, it had arrived at the worst possible time, and that the life we rebuilt without her was about to be tested in a way I hadn't anticipated. Because when someone who once left without looking back chooses Christmas to return, it's rarely about love. And as I stepped aside to let her speak, I understood that this knock wasn't reopening the past. It was challenging the future we'd fought to protect. She didn't apologize. She didn't even step inside. She stood just beyond the doorway, one hand gripping the strap of her bag, the other resting against the doorframe as if testing whether the house would reject her if she leaned in too far. And the first thing she said wasn't about the years she missed or the children she left behind, but, "I won't take much of your time." That sentence alone told me more than anything she could have explained. People who come back out of regret don't worry about time. People who come back with a purpose do. I stepped aside just enough for her to enter, not as an invitation, but because leaving her in the cold felt like starting a fight I didn't yet understand. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and suddenly the house felt different. Not invaded exactly, but unsettled, like a room where the furniture has been moved an inch off-center. She didn't look around at first. She talked, carefully, about how life had shifted, about plans that didn't hold, about how the world has a way of shrinking when you think you've secured your future and then discover it was never stable to begin with. Her words were measured, almost rehearsed, and I noticed how she avoided details, how she spoke in outlines instead of facts. When people don't want you to examine something too closely, they keep it abstract. She finally glanced past me toward the hallway, and that's when the first real disruption hit. A pair of sneakers by the wall, one larger than the other, still dusted with dried mud from earlier that afternoon. Her eyes lingered there a second too long before she looked away. She didn't ask whose they were. She didn't ask how old they were now. She just nodded slightly, as if mentally recalculating. That nod stayed with me. Her voice softened then, not emotionally, strategically. She talked about being tired, about not having anyone reliable anymore, about how strange it feels when the people you thought would always be there suddenly aren't. I said nothing. Silence has a way of encouraging people to reveal more than they intend, and she filled it quickly, mentioning doctors, paperwork, expenses. She said the word temporary more than once. Here's the rehook moment, because this is where most viewers expect anger. Instead, something colder settled in. She hadn't asked how we survived. She hadn't asked if the children were okay. She was explaining a problem and working her way toward a solution. And slowly, unmistakably, that solution was taking shape right in front of us. She needed help. She said it plainly, as if saying it plainly made it reasonable. A place to stay for a while. Support until things stabilized. She framed it as practicality, not reunion. As logistics, not emotion. But when she said, "It just makes sense," I felt something tighten. Not in my chest, but behind my eyes. Because sense, I had learned, is often what people use when they want you to ignore history. What she didn't see was the way my gaze shifted toward the living room, toward the stack of folded blankets on the chair where one of the kids liked to curl up during movies, toward the calendar on the wall marked with routines we had fought hard to establish. Stability isn't an idea. It's built out of small, repeatable things. And she was standing in the middle of them, talking as if they were flexible. She kept going. Mentioned family responsibility. Used the word fair. Spoke about rights in a way that made my jaw set before I realized it had. When someone who once disappeared starts speaking the language of entitlement, you understand something fundamental has been misjudged. She assumed the years had softened me. She assumed distance had erased memory. She assumed the door she left behind had remained unlocked. I finally spoke. Not loudly. Not emotionally. I asked one question, short enough that it couldn't be misunderstood. I didn't repeat it when she hesitated. I just waited. The silence stretched, and in it, I watched her posture change. The confidence drained slightly from her shoulders. She answered, but the answer wasn't the important part. The important part was that she suddenly stopped talking. The room felt smaller after that. The tree lights hummed faintly. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on cold pavement. She looked at me then. Not past me, not through me, but directly, as if seeing for the first time that the man standing there was not the one she had left. She asked if we could talk more after Christmas. That was new. A delay. A pause. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, This conversation had already moved further than I'd planned, and whatever came next would decide whether this visit ended as a request or became something far more complicated. Nothing moved for several seconds after I said we'd talk after Christmas. No argument. No relief spoken aloud. Just a pause where she seemed to be deciding whether this was a victory or a warning. And in that pause, the air between us felt tight, unfinished, like a sentence cut off mid-word. She nodded once, too quickly, as if agreement would make it real, and for the first time since she arrived, she stepped fully inside, only to stop again as though unsure where she was allowed to stand. She stayed less than 10 minutes, long enough to repeat that it would only be temporary, long enough to mention how difficult it is to be alone during the holidays, long enough to remind me, gently but unmistakably, that the children were still hers too. She kept her coat on the entire time. When she finally left, she didn't slam the door or linger dramatically. She just stepped back into the cold and walked away, leaving the door ajar for a second longer than necessary. I closed it without looking after her. The house settled. Something in it relaxed, but not completely. That night, I didn't replay her words for comfort or meaning. I replayed the order in which she said things. What came first? What she avoided? The way her voice changed when she talked about time. At some point, I stopped thinking altogether and just lay awake, listening to the house. The pipes, the wind, the soft click of the heater turning on and off. There was no conclusion forming, just awareness. The rehook came the next morning. Not a message, not a call, an email. The subject line was neutral, professional. It didn't come from her. Came from a lawyer. I read it once without reacting, then again more slowly. It referred to prior family arrangements, temporary accommodations, and shared responsibilities. No acquiescence. No urgency spelled out. But it had arrived less than a day after she left my house, and that timing landed harder than any threat could have. Whatever hesitation she'd shown at the door hadn't survived the night. I sat at the kitchen table with the email open on my phone. A half-finished puzzle lay where it had been abandoned the evening before. A grocery list hung crookedly from the fridge, milk circled twice. Ordinary things, steady things. And suddenly they felt exposed, not fragile exactly, but visible in a way they hadn't been before. This wasn't about conversation anymore. It was about intrusion that had learned to dress itself as procedure. I didn't answer the email, not because I had a plan ready, but because responding would have meant accepting the pace she was setting. Instead, I gathered papers I hadn't touched in years. I checked dates. I reread agreements made when exhaustion, not clarity, had driven decisions. Some details reassured me, others didn't. That unsettled me more than I expected. Preparation, I realized, doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes it just reveals where the weak points might be. That afternoon, one of the children asked who had visited. I told the truth in one sentence, then stopped. They nodded, asked if dinner would still be at the usual time, and went back to what they were doing. No shock, no excitement, just continuity. That moment stayed with me longer than the email. By Christmas Eve, the house looked the same, but it didn't feel sealed anymore. I knew something had been set in motion that wouldn't pause for holiday sentiment or wait politely for closure. And as I turned off the lights that night, it occurred to me that whatever confidence I'd felt standing in that doorway was already being tested. Not by her presence, but by how quickly absence had turned into pressure. Because when someone skips conversation and goes straight to documentation, they're not asking whether you're willing. They're betting you won't be ready. The first real challenge didn't arrive with a raised voice or a legal threat. It arrived disguised as reason, and that's what made it dangerous. 2 days after Christmas, another email came, this one warmer in tone, almost cooperative, suggesting a meeting to clarify expectations. And attached to it was a proposed timeline that assumed far more than I had agreed to, dates penciled in as if consent had already been given. For the first time since she knocked on my door, I felt pressure that didn't come from memory or emotion but from momentum, and momentum has a way of pushing you forward before you realize you're moving. I read the attachment carefully. Temporary accommodations had quietly turned into interim residence. Support had become shared responsibility. Nothing explicit, nothing outrageous. But each line leaned just slightly past where it should have stopped, like a foot nudging a door already cracked open. That's when I understood the miscalculation she'd made. She believed patience had softened me, that stability had made me predictable. What she hadn't accounted for was how alert stability makes you when you've fought to earn it. The rehook came that afternoon, not from a screen but from a phone call. One of the children mentioned, casually, without drama, that they'd been contacted. A message friendly in tone, asking if they'd like to catch up sometime soon. My chest tightened in a way it hadn't yet, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that the boundaries I thought were solid were already being tested from another angle. This wasn't coordination. It was triangulation. I didn't confront her. I didn't respond immediately to the lawyer. Instead, I sat with that information and felt something unfamiliar. Uncertainty about whether preparation alone would be enough. This wasn't a single front anymore. It was layered, quiet, and deliberate. And for the first time, I had to consider that staying calm wasn't the same as staying protected. That evening, I finally made a call I'd hoped I wouldn't need to make. Not for reassurance, for verification. What I learned unsettled me. Not because things were worse than I'd expected, but because one small assumption I'd relied on wasn't as solid as I'd believed. A technicality. A gap created years earlier when survival had taken priority over foresight. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to remind me that being right doesn't always mean being safe. I looked around the living room afterward, noticing details I usually took comfort in. The worn arm of the couch, the framed photo that never quite hung straight, and felt something shift. These weren't just symbols of a life rebuilt. They were now assets in a conflict that hadn't asked permission to exist. That realization carried weight. It meant the next move mattered more than the last one. When I finally replied to the email, my response was brief and deliberately narrow. No agreement. No refusal. Just a correction. A boundary stated plainly, without justification. I didn't know yet if it would hold. That was the point. For the first time, the outcome wasn't clear to me either. That night, sleep came in fragments. Not because I was spiraling, but because I was listening for what would come next. Because once someone starts reaching past you instead of through you, the danger isn't what they ask for. It's what they decide they're entitled to take. And as I lay there, aware that calm had finally given way to confrontation, I knew the next response wouldn't be measured in words, but in consequences neither of us could fully control yet. The first thing I lost wasn't money or leverage, it was certainty, and I lost it through a message that wasn't meant for me. It came mid-morning, forwarded quietly, with no commentary attached, and the fact that it hadn't been sent to my phone first told me something had already shifted. One of the children had been contacted again. Not casually this time. Not as a vague suggestion. Dates had been mentioned. A weekend. A plan framed as temporary but spoken with confidence. And when I read the words, my chest tightened in a way preparation hadn't protected me from. Because this wasn't pressure anymore. It was movement happening around me instead of through me. I asked what had been said, keeping my voice neutral. The answer came slowly, as if choosing words mattered now. She had told them she'd spoken to a lawyer, that things were being arranged, that they shouldn't worry, that it was time for things to feel more balanced. Not asked, told. And in that moment, I felt the cost land fully, not as anger, but as damage. Confusion where there had been steadiness. Uncertainty introduced into a routine that had taken years to stabilize. You can argue with an adult. You can counter a document. But once a child starts quietly adjusting their expectations, the harm has already begun. Here's the rehook, because this is where restraint finally stopped being neutral. I understood then that the boundary hadn't been crossed by accident. It had been tested, measured, and stepped over because it didn't hold the way she'd assumed it would. And the specific gap I'd been warned about, the one I'd hoped would stay dormant, suddenly had shape. It wasn't custody itself. It was timing, a narrow provision tied to school breaks, written years earlier when survival had mattered more than foresight, that allowed temporary contact to be initiated without prior agreement if framed as reintroduction. Limited, conditional, but usable. That afternoon, another email arrived. Firmer, shorter, less careful with tone. It referenced recent communication, without naming it, suggested coordination, and proposed moving quickly to avoid confusion. The implication was clear enough. Things had already been set in motion, and my response was now overdue. Waiting, I realized, was no longer passive. It was starting to look like consent. I made a call I'd hoped would stay theoretical. This time, there was no reassurance wrapped around the answer. The gap was real, contained but real. It didn't mean she could take control, but it meant she could force engagement, force expense, force exposure. Enough to disrupt. And disruption, I finally understood, was the objective. Stability doesn't need to be destroyed to be undermined. It just needs to be questioned in the right places. That evening, one of the children asked a question I hadn't heard in 8 years. Not emotional, not dramatic, just practical. Are things going to change? I answered carefully, honestly, without promises I couldn't keep. They nodded and went quiet. And in that quiet, something I'd protected fiercely cracked. Not visibly, not irreparably, but enough that I felt it. Enough that doing nothing no longer felt like restraint, felt like risk. I drafted a response and deleted it. Then another, each one either too sharp or too soft. For the first time since she knocked on my door, I wasn't choosing between calm and confrontation. I was choosing between protecting the life we'd built and allowing momentum to keep deciding for me. And as I sat there, aware that whatever came next would require a line to be crossed deliberately, I understood the truth that had been approaching since Christmas. This was no longer about managing the past. It was about acting in the present before hesitation became the most expensive mistake of all. The moment I sent it, there was no taking it back, and that was the point. I didn't wait for confidence to arrive or for the wording to feel comfortable. I sent a formal response that did 3 things and nothing more. It stated that contact initiated without my knowledge would stop immediately, that all communication would move through counsel, and that no arrangements involving the children would proceed without written agreement from both sides. I checked the attachments, read it once, then pressed send, aware that this single act would change how every conversation after it would be allowed to exist. The reply came quickly, brief, measured, polite in the way people are when they realize a door has closed and are deciding how to stand in front of it without losing face. She acknowledged receipt, disagreed with my interpretation, and insisted her intentions had been misunderstood. Then, near the end, a sentence appeared that mattered more than the rest. A reference to rights during school breaks and an indication that she was prepared to seek clarification if needed. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It confirmed that the line I'd drawn would be tested. That was the rupture, not because it escalated things, but because it fixed their direction. Informal pressure had become formal process. Whatever came next would be slower, documented, and harder to bend. That evening, I sat with the children and told them what they needed to know and no more. I said that plans made without us weren't plans we had to follow. I said that adults sometimes make decisions late and try to move quickly, but that speed doesn't outweigh stability. I told them that nothing would change without conversation and agreement, and that their routines mattered. I didn't explain timelines or strategies. I watched their faces instead. What I saw wasn't fear, it was relief. Here's the rehook, and it arrived quietly. One of them asked, "So does that mean she can't just decide things anymore?" The question was simple, almost technical. When I said no, clearly, without qualifiers, the room settled. Saying it out loud made it real in a way documents never do. Boundaries don't fully exist until they're spoken where they're meant to protect. The next day, a longer response arrived through counsel. More detailed now. It proposed mediation as the most reasonable path forward. Reasonable. The word had appeared before, but this time it landed differently. Not as leverage, not as pressure, just as a process that would slow things down enough to be examined. I agreed to mediation not because I expected ease, and not because I believed goodwill would suddenly appear, but because refusal would have shifted the story in a way that didn't serve us. This way, the conversation would be contained, witnessed, and limited by rules neither of us could rewrite alone. That night, after the house went quiet, I felt the weight of what had changed. Not triumph, not relief, but the steadiness that follows a decision finally acted on. The past hadn't been argued with or reimagined. It had been met with structure. Whatever happened next would unfold in rooms with neutral walls and careful words, outcomes shaped by process rather than urgency. I slept without replaying the knock or the emails, not because the situation was finished, but because it was defined. The danger had a shape now, and while nothing about the weeks ahead was guaranteed, one thing was no longer negotiable. No one would move through our lives by assumption anymore, and nothing important would happen without us being present for it.